When arrogant millionaire Alexander Sterling bet his Ferrari against a homeless old man's hunger, the crowd laughed. They stopped when the engine roared to life in the hands of a forgotten legend. The crystal chandeliers of Sterling Motors cast prismatic rainbows across the polished marble floors, where automotive masterpieces worth millions of dollars stood like monuments to human engineering achievement. This wasn't just a car dealership. It was a temple to luxury, where the world's wealthiest collectors came to acquire machines that represented the pinnacle of automotive artistry. Every vehicle on display had been handpicked by Alexander Sterling himself, a 32-year-old heir to a luxury automotive empire who had turned his inherited wealth into a personal brand built on excess, arrogance, and the casual humiliation of those he deemed beneath his social station. Alexander Sterling moved through his showroom like a king surveying his domain, his perfectly tailored Italian suit reflecting his belief that appearance was everything and substance was for people who couldn't afford style. At 32, he had never worked a day in his life in the traditional sense, but he had mastered the art of turning inherited privilege into social media influence and business opportunities that required no actual skill beyond an ability to spend money ostentatiously and speak confidently about subjects he understood only superficially. Tonight's gathering was typical of the events Alexander hosted monthly. Exclusive parties for Los Angeles' elite, where potential customers could view his latest acquisitions while enjoying premium champagne and feeling superior to the common people who would never be able to afford such luxuries. The guest list included tech billionaires, entertainment industry moguls, real estate developers, and inherited wealth socialites who competed with each other to display their sophistication through increasingly expensive purchases and public displays of their refined tastes. Among the evening's featured attractions was Alexander's latest acquisition, a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that he had purchased at auction for $48 million, making it one of the most expensive cars ever sold. The vehicle was undeniably beautiful, with flowing curves and a racing pedigree that made it a holy grail among automotive collectors. But it was also completely non-functional, a fact that Alexander presented as an amusing quirk rather than a significant flaw. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander announced to his gathered guests, raising his champagne flute toward the Ferrari, "I present the crown jewel of my collection, $48 million of pure Italian artistry. She's absolutely perfect in every way except one small detail. No one has been able to make her run in over 20 years. The crowd laughed appreciatively at what they assumed was Alexander's typical self-deprecating humor. These were people who could afford to buy cars that didn't work simply because they were beautiful or historically significant. Functionality was often considered less important than provenance or rarity. The previous owner tried everything," Alexander continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "He took her to Ferrari specialists in Italy, classic car restoration experts in Germany, and racing mechanics who had worked on the original racing team. They all said the same thing. The engine is technically perfect, but something prevents it from starting. It's become something of a legend in collector circles, the beautiful Ferrari that simply refuses to run." Victoria Ashworth, a socialite whose family owned half of Beverly Hills, raised her hand with mock concern. "Alexander, darling, doesn't it bother you to own something so expensive that doesn't actually work?" Alexander's smile widened with the confidence of someone who had never experienced genuine failure or consequence. "Victoria, when you're at my level, you realize that some things are valuable precisely because they're impossible. This Ferrari represents the ultimate collector's paradox, priceless and worthless simultaneously. It's absolutely fascinating from a philosophical perspective." The crowd murmured appreciative agreement, though most of them were more interested in being seen at Alexander's exclusive event than in contemplating automotive philosophy. They were the kind of people who bought art they didn't understand, and wine they couldn't taste simply because experts told them it was valuable. Outside the showroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, Los Angeles stretched into the distance like a sprawling circuit board, its lights twinkling with the promise of dreams and the reality of inequality. The contrast between the opulent interior and the harsh streets beyond was stark but invisible to the people inside, who had long ago insulated themselves from any awareness of how the other 99% of humanity lived. Henry Thompson stood on the sidewalk outside Sterling Motors, pressing his weathered hands against the cold glass, as he stared at the gathering inside. At 73, Henry looked every day of his age and then some. His clothes were clean but worn, clearly purchased from thrift stores or charity organizations. His shoes had been resoled multiple times, and his jacket bore the kind of careful patches that spoke of someone who couldn't afford to replace things when they wore out. His beard was gray and unkempt, not from choice, but from lack of access to proper grooming facilities. Henry was homeless, had been for 3 years since the economic downturn had cost him his apartment, and his fixed-income pension had proven inadequate to cover Los Angeles's skyrocketing living costs. He spent his nights in shelters when beds were available and in doorways when they weren't. His days were consumed with the practical challenges of survival, finding food, staying clean, avoiding the police, and maintaining enough dignity to keep hope alive. The transition from respected professional to invisible street person had been gradual and devastating. Henry remembered the exact moment when everything began to unravel. The day he had been forced to retire from Morrison Classic Automotive, the specialized restoration shop where he had worked for the final 15 years of his career. The owner, Bill Morrison, had been apologetic but firm. Computer diagnostics and modern equipment were making traditional mechanical knowledge obsolete. "Henry, you're the best mechanic I've ever known," Morrison had told him that devastating afternoon. "But the insurance company is requiring all our technicians to have current computer diagnostic certifications. The cost of getting you trained on the new equipment, well, at your age, it just doesn't make financial sense." Henry had understood the business logic, even as it destroyed his sense of purpose and identity. He had spent 45 years developing expertise that was suddenly viewed as obsolete. The automotive industry that had once valued his knowledge now saw him as a relic from an earlier era. The years immediately following his retirement had been difficult but manageable. Henry's pension, while modest, had been sufficient to cover basic living expenses in the small apartment he had rented for 20 years. But the economic recession had been the final blow. Henry's pension fund had been devastated by market losses, reducing his monthly income by nearly 60%. Within 18 months, he had been forced to choose between paying rent and buying food. Henry's descent into homelessness had been swift and humiliating. The social services system was overwhelmed and underfunded, with waiting lists for affordable housing that stretched for years. Henry had quickly learned the unwritten rules of street survival: which neighborhoods were safe at night, which businesses might provide temporary work, which social service agencies offered the most effective assistance. But the most devastating aspect of homelessness hadn't been the physical discomfort, or even the constant threat of violence. It had been the way that society suddenly stopped seeing him as a person with value and knowledge. Henry's decades of expertise, his legendary reputation within the classic car community, his ability to solve mechanical problems that stumped other experts, all of it became invisible the moment his appearance marked him as homeless. People looked through him now, or past him, treating him as an obstacle to be avoided rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. Henry had learned to navigate this invisibility, using it as protection while mourning the loss of professional identity that had defined his self-worth for so many years. The Ferrari symptoms, as described by Alexander Sterling, suggested exactly the kind of mystery that Henry had spent his career solving. An engine that seemed mechanically perfect but refused to start. Multiple experts who had found nothing wrong. A problem that had persisted for years despite extensive investigation. Henry closed his eyes and let his memory drift back to that day nearly 30 years earlier, when he had first encountered what he believed was the same Ferrari. The wealthy collector who had owned it then had been paranoid about theft and obsessed with security systems that wouldn't compromise the car's originality. "I need something that will stop thieves from driving my car away," the collector had explained. "But it has to be completely invisible to casual inspection." Henry had spent weeks designing and implementing the solution. The fuel cutoff system he created was ingenious in its simplicity, a mechanical valve hidden within the car's original fuel delivery system, activated by a lever camouflaged to look like standard factory equipment. The collector had been thrilled with the solution, but apparently that information hadn't been passed along to subsequent owners. The irony was almost poetic. Henry's most elegant solution had become someone else's unsolvable problem. The homeless man that society had rendered invisible possessed the key to a mystery that had frustrated experts and cost the current owner $48 million. As Henry watched the party continue inside Sterling Motors, he began to understand that he was being presented with an opportunity that went far beyond simply fixing a broken car. He had a chance to remind the world that expertise and knowledge had value regardless of how they were packaged. He could prove that society's assumptions about worth and capability were often completely wrong. The decision to approach Alexander Sterling hadn't been impulsive. Henry had spent 20 minutes standing outside the dealership, considering the potential consequences of his actions. He could be arrested for trespassing. He could be publicly humiliated when his claims proved incorrect. He could confirm everyone's worst assumptions about homeless people being delusional or mentally unstable. But Henry had also realized that he had nothing left to lose. His reputation was already destroyed. His professional identity was already considered obsolete. His social status was already at rock bottom. The worst that could happen was that he would return to invisibility, no worse off than he was before. The best that could happen was that he might remind the world that human knowledge and skill never truly became obsolete, even when society temporarily forgot their value. Henry had made similar bets throughout his career, though never with stakes this high. He had built his reputation by taking on problems that other mechanics deemed impossible, by proposing solutions that seemed unlikely, by trusting his understanding of mechanical systems, even when conventional wisdom suggested he was wrong. This was simply the largest and most public version of the same gamble Henry had been making his entire professional life. The bet that knowledge and experience would triumph over assumptions and prejudices when given the opportunity to demonstrate themselves. But Henry Thompson had not always been homeless. He had not always been invisible to people like those gathered in Alexander Sterling's showroom. Once, a very long time ago, Henry had been someone whose name was spoken with respect in the automotive industry. He had been Henry Thompson, master mechanic and engine specialist, whose hands could diagnose problems that left other experts baffled, and whose understanding of internal combustion engines was considered almost mystical by those who worked with him. Henry had spent 45 years working on cars, starting as an apprentice in Detroit during the golden age of American automotive manufacturing, and gradually developing a reputation as someone who could solve problems that seemed impossible. He had worked for racing teams, restoration shops, and private collectors who sought him out specifically because he could make engines run that other mechanics declared hopeless. But the automotive industry had changed dramatically during Henry's career. Computer diagnostics had replaced intuitive mechanical knowledge. Young technicians with college degrees and electronic equipment had gradually displaced experienced mechanics who relied on their hands, ears, and understanding of mechanical systems. Henry's kind of knowledge had become obsolete, viewed as quaint but impractical in an age of computerized engine management systems and electronic fuel injection. When Henry finally retired, he discovered that his lifetime of specialized knowledge had earned him very little in terms of financial security. His pension was modest, his savings minimal, and his skills were no longer valued in a marketplace that prioritized credentials over capability. The economic recession had eliminated what little financial stability he had managed to accumulate, and Henry had joined the ranks of older Americans who discovered that a lifetime of hard work was no guarantee against poverty in old age. Now Henry spent his evenings walking through wealthy neighborhoods, not because he enjoyed tormenting himself with displays of luxury he couldn't afford, but because the well-lit streets were safer, and the businesses often threw away food that was still perfectly edible. Sterling Motors was on his regular route, and he had often paused to look at the automotive treasures displayed inside. Tonight was different, though. Tonight Henry could hear the party through the showroom's windows, and something the young man in the expensive suit was saying had caught his attention. As Henry pressed closer to the glass, trying to understand the conversation, Alexander Sterling's voice became clearer. $48 million, and she won't even turn over, Alexander was saying with obvious amusement. The engine is supposedly perfect, but something prevents it from starting. It's been a mystery for over 20 years. Henry felt his pulse quicken as he studied the Ferrari more closely. Even from outside the building, even through multiple layers of glass and at a considerable distance, there was something familiar about the car's stance and proportions. Henry had worked on very few Ferraris during his career. They were rare and expensive, even when he was actively working, But there had been one particular 250 GTO that he remembered vividly. It had been nearly 30 years ago, when Henry was still at the peak of his career and reputation. A wealthy collector had brought him a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that had been experiencing intermittent starting problems. The car would run perfectly for weeks or months, then suddenly refused to start for no apparent reason. Multiple specialists had examined the vehicle and found nothing wrong, but the problem persisted. Henry had spent 3 days with that Ferrari, methodically checking every system and component until he discovered the issue, a tiny flaw in the car's original wiring harness that created an intermittent electrical fault. The problem was so subtle that it didn't show up on any diagnostic equipment, but it was enough to prevent reliable starting. Henry had corrected the issue with a repair so elegant and unobtrusive that it was virtually invisible to casual inspection. But Henry remembered something else about that particular Ferrari. The wealthy collector who owned it had been paranoid about theft and had asked Henry to install a hidden security system that would prevent the car from starting unless activated by a specific sequence of actions. The system was completely mechanical, requiring no electronic components that might fail or be detected by modern diagnostic equipment. The security system Henry had designed was ingenious in its simplicity. It involved a small lever hidden behind the dashboard that had to be moved to a specific position before the engine would receive fuel. The lever was camouflaged to look like a standard factory component, and its location was known only to Henry and the car's owner. If the sequence wasn't followed, the engine would turn over normally but never start, because no fuel would reach the cylinders. Henry stared at the Ferrari in Alexander Sterling's showroom, trying to determine if it was the same vehicle he had worked on decades earlier. The configuration looked right. The proportions matched his memory. Most importantly, the symptoms Alexander was describing, an engine that seemed mechanically perfect but refused to start, matched exactly what would happen if someone tried to start the car without activating the hidden security system. If Henry was correct, if this was the same Ferrari he had worked on 30 years ago, then he alone knew the secret that would make the car run. The irony was overwhelming. A homeless old man standing outside a luxury dealership, knowing the solution to a mystery that had baffled experts and cost the current owner $48 million. Henry watched the party continue inside, observing the casual wealth and easy confidence of people who had never worried about where their next meal would come from. He studied Alexander Sterling, noting the young man's arrogant posture and the way he spoke about the Ferrari, as if its non-functionality was an amusing conversation piece rather than a serious mechanical problem. An idea began to form in Henry's mind. It was risky, probably foolish, and would require courage he wasn't sure he still possessed. But as he watched Alexander Sterling hold court among his wealthy friends, treating a magnificent machine like a trophy to be displayed rather than a puzzle to be solved, Henry felt something stir inside him that had been dormant for years, professional pride mixed with righteous indignation. Henry had spent his entire career bringing broken engines back to life. He had taken machines that other mechanics declared hopeless and made them run better than they ever had before. It had been his calling, his gift, and his passion. Standing outside Sterling Motors, looking at a Ferrari that he believed he could fix in 5 minutes, Henry felt the old fire returning. The party inside was reaching its peak, with guests clustering around the Ferrari, and Alexander Sterling clearly enjoying his role as the evening's central attraction. Henry could see him gesturing grandly, obviously telling stories about the car's mysterious ailment and the frustrated experts who had failed to solve its problems. Henry made his decision. He had nothing left to lose, and perhaps something to gain. At worst, he would be thrown out of the dealership and return to his invisible existence on the streets. At best, he might remind the world that knowledge and experience had value, regardless of how they were packaged. Henry walked around the building until he found the main entrance. The doorman, a professional security guard hired for the evening's event, immediately stepped forward to block his path. The man's expression made it clear that Henry's appearance marked him as someone who didn't belong at this kind of gathering. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private event," the doorman said politely but firmly. "Invitation only." Henry looked past the doorman into the showroom, where Alexander Sterling was still entertaining his guests with stories about the impossible Ferrari. "I need to speak with Mr. Sterling about his car." The doorman's expression shifted from polite professionalism to barely concealed amusement. "Sir, Mr. Sterling is hosting an exclusive event for his clients. I'm sure if you're interested in viewing our inventory, someone can schedule an appointment for you during regular business hours." Henry understood the subtext perfectly. The doorman was assuming that someone who looked like Henry couldn't possibly afford anything in Sterling Motors and was probably suffering from mental illness or substance abuse. It was the kind of assumption Henry had grown accustomed to during his years of homelessness, that his appearance told people everything they needed to know about his worth and capabilities. "Please tell Mr. Sterling that I can fix his Ferrari," Henry said quietly. "Tell him I know why it won't start." The doorman's amusement became more obvious. "Sir, that car has been examined by some of the world's leading automotive experts. I really don't think—" "Just tell him," Henry interrupted, his voice carrying a note of authority that surprised both men. "Tell him that someone is here who can make his Ferrari run." The doorman hesitated, clearly trying to decide whether to simply refuse Henry's request or to humor what he assumed was a delusional homeless person. Finally, perhaps thinking it might provide some entertainment for the party guests, he agreed to relay the message. "Wait here," the doorman said, stepping inside the building. Henry watched through the glass as the doorman approached Alexander Sterling and whispered something in his ear. He saw Alexander's expression change from mild curiosity to obvious amusement as he looked toward the entrance where Henry was waiting. Alexander Sterling walked toward the door with the confident stride of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't control through wealth or social position. His guests followed at a respectful distance, clearly sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. When Alexander opened the door, his first reaction was exactly what Henry had expected. Barely concealed disgust mixed with the kind of patronizing amusement that wealthy people often displayed when confronted with evidence of poverty. "My doorman tells me you think you can fix my Ferrari," Alexander said, his tone making it clear that he viewed the conversation as an amusing diversion rather than a serious discussion. "That's quite a claim, considering that some of the world's most expensive automotive specialists have already tried and failed." Henry met Alexander's gaze steadily, noting the young man's expensive clothes, perfect grooming, and the casual confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "I can fix your car," Henry said simply. Alexander's smile widened as he turned back toward his guests, clearly preparing to share this amusing encounter with his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a volunteer. This gentleman claims he can solve the mystery of my Ferrari." The crowd of wealthy party guests moved closer, their expressions ranging from curious to openly mocking. These were people who were accustomed to being entertained by the eccentricities of less fortunate individuals, and Henry's claim clearly struck them as either delusional or desperately calculating. "Tell me," Alexander continued, his voice carrying across the showroom, "what makes you think you can succeed where Ferrari's own engineers have failed?" Henry looked at the assembled crowd of wealthy socialites and business moguls, all dressed in clothes that cost more than most people earned in months, all clearly expecting to be entertained by his presumed desperation or mental instability. He thought about the 45 years he had spent working with his hands, solving problems that had stumped more credentialed experts, bringing life back to machines that others had declared hopeless. "I worked on that car before," Henry said quietly. "About 30 years ago. I know what's wrong with it." Alexander's expression shifted slightly, moving from pure amusement toward something that might have been actual curiosity. "You worked on my specific car? This exact vehicle?" "If it's the same one," Henry replied. "Red 1962 250 GTO, chassis number 343. The owner was worried about theft, so I installed a security system. That's why it won't start." The specificity of Henry's answer clearly surprised Alexander. He hadn't expected the homeless man to know technical details about the Ferrari, and the chassis number was correct. "A security system?" Alexander asked. "What kind of security system?" "Hidden fuel cutoff," Henry explained. "Mechanical, not electronic. Unless you know how to activate it, the engine will turn over but never start because no fuel reaches the cylinders." The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond simple entertainment into something more serious. Alexander looked back at the Ferrari, then returned his attention to Henry. "Even if that were true," Alexander said, "why should I believe that you're the person who installed this supposed security system? You could have heard about it from someone else, or read about it somewhere. Henry nodded, understanding Alexander's skepticism. The activation sequence requires moving a lever behind the dashboard. It looks like a factory choke cable, but it's actually the fuel system override. You have to pull it exactly 3 inches and hold it while you turn the ignition key. Alexander stared at Henry for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether the old man was telling the truth or had somehow learned specific details about the Ferrari through other means. The gathered crowd waited expectantly, sensing that something significant was happening but not quite understanding what. "All right," Alexander said finally, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was prepared to be entertained by an amusing failure. "Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say you really did work on this car 30 years ago, and you really do know why it won't start. What do you want in return for fixing it?" Henry looked at Alexander Sterling. Young, wealthy, arrogant, surrounded by people who valued appearance over substance and money over knowledge. He thought about the long years since his retirement, the gradual slide into poverty, the nights spent sleeping in doorways while people like Alexander threw away more money in a single evening than Henry had earned in entire years of skilled labor. "If I can make your car start," Henry said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent showroom, "I want you to give it to me." The silence that followed Henry's statement was absolute. For several seconds, no one in the showroom moved or spoke. The audacity of a homeless man demanding a $48 million Ferrari in exchange for starting it was so far beyond their experience that they couldn't immediately process what they had heard. The gathered crowd represented the pinnacle of Los Angeles's social and economic hierarchy. These weren't simply wealthy people. They were the ultra-wealthy, individuals whose net worth was measured in hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Yet they were all staring at a homeless man who was proposing to win $48 million through what appeared to be nothing more than mechanical expertise. Victoria Ashworth found herself studying Henry's face, trying to reconcile his appearance with the confidence in his voice. Something about Henry's demeanor suggested that his claim wasn't the desperate bluff of a delusional homeless person. Marcus Chen, a tech billionaire who had made his fortune developing automotive software, understood enough about classic Ferrari engineering to know that the 250 GTO's mechanical systems were incredibly complex. If Henry really could identify and fix the issue, it would represent genuinely extraordinary mechanical knowledge. The crowd's initial amusement was gradually being replaced by curiosity and something approaching respect. These were sophisticated people who understood that expertise could be found in surprising places. Alexander Sterling himself was experiencing a complex mixture of emotions as he processed Henry's proposal. Part of him was still amused by what seemed like an elaborate bluff. Another part was genuinely curious about whether the old man might actually possess the knowledge he claimed. Alexander looked around at his guests, reading the curiosity and expectation in their faces. These were people who valued competence and expertise, even when it came from unexpected sources. The smart play, Alexander realized, was to treat Henry's proposal seriously, regardless of whether he believed it would succeed. Then Alexander Sterling began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then built into the kind of full-throated laughter that comes from encountering something so absurd that it transcends normal social boundaries. His guests joined in, filling the showroom with the sound of wealthy people being entertained by what they perceived as the desperate delusions of poverty. But even as Alexander laughed, he was calculating the potential outcomes of Henry's proposal. The Ferrari had been nothing more than an expensive conversation piece for months. If it really couldn't be fixed, then he wasn't risking anything by allowing Henry to attempt the repair. The worst that could happen was that Henry would fail publicly, providing entertainment for Alexander's guests and confirming their assumptions about homeless people being delusional. The best that could happen was that Henry would somehow succeed, making Alexander appear incredibly generous for honoring such an extraordinary bet. Either way, the story would become legendary within their social circle, cementing Alexander's reputation as someone who hosted the most memorable and exclusive events in Los Angeles. "You want me to give you a $48 million Ferrari?" Alexander asked between fits of laughter. "In exchange for turning a key?" The question revealed Alexander's fundamental misunderstanding of what Henry was proposing. Henry wasn't claiming that fixing the Ferrari would be simple. He was claiming that he possessed specific knowledge about the car that other experts lacked. The distinction was important, but Alexander's privileged background had never required him to understand the difference between simplicity and expertise. Henry had encountered similar misunderstandings throughout his career. Wealthy customers often assumed that because a repair looked easy when performed by an expert, it must actually be easy. They didn't understand that what appeared simple was often the result of decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. The repair itself might be simple, Henry replied patiently, but knowing what needs to be repaired requires understanding something that your experts don't know. Alexander's laughter gradually subsided as he processed Henry's response. The old man wasn't claiming to possess magical powers or impossible knowledge. He was simply suggesting that he had information about the Ferrari that others lacked. It was a reasonable claim, even if Henry's appearance made it seem unlikely. "All right," Alexander said, his tone shifting from pure mockery to something that might have been genuine curiosity. "Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say you really do know something about my Ferrari that multiple experts have missed. How could that be possible?" The question gave Henry an opportunity to explain his background without sounding defensive or desperate. "Because I worked on your specific car 30 years ago, before it became a mystery. I know what was done to it that your experts don't know to look for." Alexander studied Henry's face carefully, looking for signs of deception or delusion. What he saw instead was the calm confidence of someone who was absolutely certain of his facts. Henry's claim was specific enough to be verifiable and reasonable enough to be credible. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond simple entertainment into something more serious. These were people who understood the value of specialized knowledge and expertise. If Henry really had worked on the Ferrari previously, his claim became much more plausible. "Even if that's true," Alexander said slowly, "you're still asking me to bet a $48 million car on your ability to remember something from 30 years ago." "You want me to give you a $48 million Ferrari?" Alexander asked between fits of laughter. "In exchange for turning a key?" Henry stood quietly while the laughter swirled around him, maintaining his dignity despite the obvious mockery. He had expected this reaction. Wealthy people always found it amusing when poor people asked for things they couldn't afford, as if poverty was a form of entertainment designed for their enjoyment. "If the car won't start, it's worthless to you," Henry replied calmly. "You said so yourself. It's been sitting here for months as nothing more than an expensive sculpture. What good is a Ferrari that won't run?" Alexander's laughter subsided, but his expression remained thoroughly amused. "So let me understand this correctly. You're proposing a bet. If you can start my Ferrari, I give it to you. And if you can't?" Henry considered the question. He had nothing of value to offer as collateral, nothing that would seem significant to someone with Alexander's wealth. "If I can't start it, you call the police and have me arrested for trespassing." The crowd found this proposal even more entertaining than Henry's initial demand. The idea of a homeless man risking arrest to win a Ferrari struck them as the kind of desperate gamble that confirmed all their assumptions about the poor making irrational decisions. "This is fascinating," Victoria Ashworth commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's like watching someone play the lottery with their freedom as the stake." Alexander looked around at his guests, clearly enjoying being the center of attention during what was turning into the evening's main entertainment. He was confident that Henry's claim was either delusional or fraudulent, but the spectacle was providing exactly the kind of exclusive experience that made his parties memorable. "You know what?" Alexander announced to the crowd. "Why not? This is the most interesting thing that's happened at one of my parties in months. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to witness either a miracle or a very public demonstration of the dangers of desperation." He turned back to Henry with an expression of exaggerated generosity. "I accept your terms, old man. If you can start my Ferrari, it's yours, and if you can't, you go to jail. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this wager?" Henry nodded without hesitation. "I'm certain." Alexander gestured grandly toward the Ferrari. "Then by all means, work your magic. But I should warn you, every automotive expert who has examined this car has concluded that starting it would require extensive engine work. You're claiming you can do it by pulling a hidden lever. That seems rather unlikely." Henry walked toward the Ferrari with measured steps, acutely aware that every eye in the showroom was following his movement. The crowd of wealthy spectators formed a semicircle around the car, clearly positioning themselves for the best view of what they expected to be Henry's humiliating failure. As Henry approached the Ferrari, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and confidence that had always accompanied his mechanical work. Regardless of how much time had passed, regardless of how much the automotive industry had changed, the fundamental relationship between a skilled mechanic and a broken machine remained the same. It was about understanding how systems worked and diagnosing why they didn't. Henry opened the Ferrari's driver's side door, noting the soft leather seats and the precisely crafted dashboard that reflected the pinnacle of early 1960s automotive luxury. He slid into the driver's seat, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel as he oriented himself within the car's interior. The crowd pressed closer, with several guests holding up their phones to record what they expected to be either a miraculous success or an entertaining failure. Alexander Sterling positioned himself where he could see both Henry and his guests' reactions, clearly prepared to enjoy whatever happened next. Henry reached under the dashboard, his fingers searching for the hidden lever he had installed 3 decades earlier. For a moment he experienced a flash of doubt. What if his memory was wrong? What if this wasn't the same Ferrari? What if the security system had been discovered and removed during one of the many attempts to repair the car? Then his fingers found the lever, exactly where he remembered installing it. The metal was cold and slightly corroded, but the mechanism moved smoothly when Henry tested it. He smiled slightly, remembering the care with which he had designed the system to be both undetectable and reliable. "Are you finding what you're looking for under there?" Alexander called out mockingly. "Or are you just stalling while you figure out how to admit this was all an elaborate bluff?" Henry didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he pulled the hidden lever exactly 3 inches, feeling the mechanical fuel valve click into its open position. Then he inserted the Ferrari's key into the ignition and turned it. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened, and Henry could hear Alexander Sterling beginning to chuckle behind him. Then, with a sound like controlled thunder, the Ferrari's V12 engine roared to life. The sound that filled the showroom was unmistakably that of a perfectly tuned high-performance engine operating exactly as its designers had intended. The Ferrari's exhaust note was deep and musical, with the kind of mechanical symphony that only a hand-built racing engine could produce. It was the sound of $48 million worth of automotive history, suddenly transformed from an expensive sculpture into a living, breathing machine. The acoustic signature of a Ferrari V12 engine is instantly recognizable to anyone with knowledge of high-performance automobiles. It's a sound that combines power with refinement, aggression with sophistication. The engine note rises and falls with a musical quality that reflects the precise engineering and hand assembly that went into its creation. It's the sound that automotive enthusiasts dream about, the mechanical equivalent of a perfectly tuned orchestra performing a masterpiece. But more than just the engine's sound, the entire character of the Ferrari had changed in an instant. Where moments before it had been a static display piece, beautiful but lifeless, it was now a functioning automobile radiating the kinetic energy that its designers had intended. The car seemed to pulse with mechanical life, its engine settling into a perfect idyll that spoke of optimal fuel mixture, proper ignition timing, and harmonious operation of hundreds of precisely manufactured components. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it took several seconds for the assembled crowd to fully process what they were witnessing. They had spent months, in some cases years, hearing about the Ferrari that couldn't be started. Multiple experts had examined the car and declared its problems too complex for quick resolution. The vehicle had become legendary within their social circle as an example of how even unlimited money couldn't solve certain problems. Now, in the span of perhaps 30 seconds, a homeless man they had been prepared to mock had accomplished what teams of certified specialists had failed to achieve. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Victoria Ashworth found herself staring at Henry with an expression of complete amazement. As someone who had built her fortune by accurately assessing value and potential, she was struggling to reconcile what she was witnessing with her preconceptions about expertise and social status. The man sitting calmly in the Ferrari's driver's seat looked exactly like what he was, an elderly homeless person wearing thrift store clothes. But he had just demonstrated mechanical knowledge that was apparently worth tens of millions of dollars. Marcus Chen was performing rapid mental calculations about the implications of what he had just witnessed. His technology company specialized in automotive diagnostic software, and he understood better than most guests how complex modern automotive problems could be. The fact that Henry had solved the Ferrari's issues so quickly suggested not just knowledge but intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that couldn't be learned from textbooks or diagnostic computers. Dr. Patricia Williams recognized the moment as similar to breakthrough discoveries in her pharmaceutical research, situations where someone with deep understanding of underlying systems could identify solutions that appeared impossible to others. She had seen brilliant researchers solve problems that had stumped entire teams of experts, but usually those breakthroughs came from people with impressive credentials and institutional support. Henry's achievement was even more remarkable because it came from someone society had completely written off. The younger guests, particularly those who had inherited their wealth rather than building it themselves, were experiencing a different kind of shock. Their worldview was built on the assumption that success and competence were directly correlated with social status and material wealth. Henry's demonstration challenged those assumptions in a way that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Alexander Sterling stood beside the car with his mouth open, staring at the old man who had just made his $48 million paperweight into a functioning automobile. The expression on his face was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. But underneath those immediate reactions was a growing awareness of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Alexander had built his reputation on being able to recognize value and opportunity. His success in the luxury automotive business depended on his ability to identify exceptional cars, understand market trends, and connect with clients who valued expertise and exclusivity. If he had so completely misread Henry Thompson's capabilities, what did that say about his judgment in other areas? The business implications were staggering. If Henry really was the legendary mechanic that some of the older guests seemed to recognize, then Alexander had just gained access to knowledge and expertise that money couldn't buy. The diagnostic and restoration capabilities that Henry represented could transform Sterling Motors from an expensive car dealership into a world-renowned center for automotive excellence. But the personal implications were equally significant. Alexander had publicly dismissed and mocked someone whose knowledge had just proven to be extraordinarily valuable. His behavior reflected poorly on his character and judgment, and it had been witnessed by dozens of people whose opinions influenced his reputation within Los Angeles's elite social circles. The silence that followed the Ferrari's initial roar was even more profound than the silence that had greeted Henry's original proposal. Every person in the showroom stood frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The homeless man they had been prepared to mock had just accomplished something that multiple experts had declared impossible. Henry sat in the driver's seat, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel as the Ferrari idled with perfect smoothness around him. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the engine through the car's frame, the familiar sensation of a well-tuned machine operating in perfect harmony. It was a feeling he had missed more than he had realized during his years away from serious mechanical work. For Henry, the moment represented validation that transcended the monetary value of the Ferrari or the social status of the people surrounding him. It was confirmation that his lifetime of accumulated knowledge still had value, that the expertise he had spent decades developing hadn't become obsolete despite society's dismissal of traditional mechanical skills. The engine's perfect idle was more than just mechanical achievement. It was vindication of an approach to problem-solving that prioritized understanding over credentials, experience over education, and intuitive knowledge over technological solutions. Henry had proven that some problems required human insight that couldn't be replaced by computers or institutional expertise. As Henry sat listening to the Ferrari's engine, he thought about all the other homeless individuals he had encountered who possessed valuable skills and knowledge that society was wasting. Master craftsmen, experienced tradespeople, skilled professionals who had been rendered invisible by economic circumstances or social prejudices. How many of them possessed expertise that could benefit society if anyone bothered to recognize and utilize it? The Ferrari's transformation from broken sculpture to functional masterpiece was a metaphor for the human potential that was being wasted on America's streets. Henry's story could be repeated thousands of times with different individuals and different skills. If society could learn to look beyond appearances and preconceptions, to recognize the value that existed in unexpected places.
But for now, Henry was content to sit in the driver's seat of one of the world's most valuable automobiles, surrounded by people who were finally beginning to understand that expertise and knowledge came in many forms, and that assumptions based on appearance were often completely wrong.
Alexander Sterling stood beside the car with his mouth open, staring at the old man who had just made his $48 million paperweight into a functioning automobile. The expression on his face was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "How?" Alexander asked, his voice barely audible over the Ferrari's idle. "How did you do that?" Henry turned off the engine and climbed out of the driver's seat, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had just proven a point that was 30 years in the making. He looked at Alexander, then at the crowd of wealthy spectators who were still processing what they had witnessed. "I told you," Henry said quietly. "I worked on this car before. I knew what was wrong with it." The crowd remained silent, but their expressions had changed dramatically. The patronizing amusement had been replaced by something approaching awe, mixed with the uncomfortable realization that they had badly misjudged the man they had been prepared to mock. Victoria Ashworth was the first to speak. "Alexander," she said slowly, "I believe this gentleman has just won your Ferrari." Alexander looked at the car, then at Henry, then back at the car. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. He had made a public bet in front of dozens of witnesses, and he had lost spectacularly. "This is impossible," Alexander said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be some explanation. Maybe the car was already fixed, and this was all some kind of elaborate setup." Henry shook his head. "The security system I installed 30 years ago was designed to be completely undetectable. Your experts couldn't find it because they didn't know to look for it. They assumed the problem was mechanical failure rather than an intentional security feature." "But why would someone install a security system that prevented the car from starting?" one of the guests asked. "Because in 1990 this Ferrari was worth about $2 million, and the owner was terrified it would be stolen," Henry explained. "He wanted a system that would prevent thieves from driving it away even if they managed to get the keys. The system I designed was foolproof. Unless you knew exactly how to activate it, the car was undrivable." Alexander stared at the Ferrari, clearly struggling to accept that he had just lost the most expensive item in his collection to a homeless man. "Even if that's true," he said, "even if you really did install this security system, that doesn't change the fact that you're asking me to give you a $48 million car." "I'm not asking," Henry replied calmly. "We made a bet, in front of all these witnesses. I fulfilled my part of the agreement. The question is whether you're going to honor yours." The crowd turned their attention to Alexander, clearly curious to see how he would handle being outmaneuvered by someone he had obviously underestimated. His reputation as a savvy businessman was suddenly being tested in the most public possible way. Alexander looked around at his guests, reading the expectation in their faces. These were people who valued honor and integrity, at least in their business dealings. Refusing to honor a publicly made bet would damage his reputation far more than losing an expensive car. "Fine," Alexander said finally, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "A bet is a bet. The Ferrari is yours." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the car's keys, holding them toward Henry with obvious reluctance. "But I want to know something first. Who are you? You're clearly not just some random homeless person. You know too much about automotive engineering." Henry took the keys, feeling their weight in his palm. They represented not just ownership of an incredibly valuable car, but validation of a lifetime of expertise that had been dismissed and forgotten. "My name is Henry Thompson," he said. "I was a master mechanic for 45 years. I worked on racing cars, classic restorations, and custom builds for collectors who wanted the impossible. I retired 15 years ago, and I've been homeless for the last 3 years." "Henry Thompson," one of the older guests repeated slowly. "That name sounds familiar. Didn't you work for Harrison Classic Cars back in the 80s? Henry nodded. "Among other places. I worked wherever there were interesting problems to solve." "I remember you," the guest continued, his voice growing more excited. "You're the mechanic who figured out why the Shelby Cobra at the Peterson Museum wouldn't run. And you restored the engine in David Chang's Ferrari Daytona." Other guests began murmuring recognition as Henry's name triggered memories of his legendary reputation within the classic car community. These were people who owned expensive automobiles and understood the value of truly exceptional mechanical expertise. Alexander Sterling stared at Henry with growing awareness of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. "You're telling me that you're Henry Thompson, the legendary Henry Thompson, and you've been living on the streets?" "Legends don't pay rent," Henry replied. "And the automotive industry moved on from people like me a long time ago. Computer diagnostics replaced intuitive knowledge. Young technicians with college degrees replaced experienced mechanics who learned their trade through apprenticeship." The statement hung in the air, a quiet indictment of an industry that had valued credentials over capability and efficiency over craftsmanship. Several of the guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the broader social implications of what Henry was describing. "This is unacceptable," Victoria Ashworth announced suddenly. "Henry, you shouldn't be living on the streets. You're a master craftsman, a living treasure of automotive knowledge. Something needs to be done about this situation." Other guests began voicing similar sentiments, their earlier amusement replaced by genuine concern and a dawning awareness of their own complicity in a system that had allowed someone of Henry's stature to fall into homelessness. Alexander Sterling looked around at his guests, then back at Henry. The evening had taken a turn that he hadn't anticipated, and he was struggling to process the social and personal implications of what had just happened. "Henry," Alexander said slowly, "I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you respect that I failed to show when you first approached me. But I also want to offer you something beyond the Ferrari." Henry raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I want to offer you a job," Alexander continued. "Sterling Motors needs someone with your expertise. We deal with the most expensive and complex automobiles in the world, and we regularly encounter problems that stump our current technicians. I want you to be our master diagnostic specialist." The offer surprised Henry, but he could see the calculation behind Alexander's generosity. Hiring the legendary Henry Thompson would be excellent for Sterling Motors' reputation, and it would also demonstrate Alexander's ability to recognize and correct his mistakes. "What would the position involve?" Henry asked. "Solving problems that other people can't solve," Alexander replied. "Working on cars that collectors bring to us when they've exhausted every other option. Teaching our younger technicians the kind of intuitive mechanical knowledge that can't be learned from textbooks or computer diagnostics." Henry considered the offer carefully. It would mean returning to the work he loved, sharing knowledge that he had spent a lifetime accumulating, and regaining the financial stability that would allow him to live with dignity. "I accept," Henry said finally, "but I have some conditions." Alexander nodded. "Name them." "I want to establish a scholarship program for young people who want to learn traditional mechanical skills. The automotive industry has become too focused on technology, and not focused enough on understanding how machines actually work. I want to help train the next generation of real mechanics." "Agreed," Alexander said immediately. "What else?" "I want to work with local shelters and social services to identify other skilled tradespeople who have become homeless. There are probably dozens of master craftsmen living on the streets, their knowledge wasted because society has decided their skills are obsolete." Alexander nodded again. "We'll establish a program to identify and assist skilled individuals who have fallen through society's safety net." "What else?" Henry looked around at the assembled crowd of wealthy collectors and automotive enthusiasts. "I want your customers to understand that the value of a car isn't just in its price tag or its rarity. It's in the craftsmanship, engineering, and human knowledge that went into creating it. Too many people buy expensive cars as investments or status symbols without appreciating the mechanical artistry they represent. That's something I can definitely help with," Alexander agreed. "Our clientele should understand and appreciate the technical excellence of the machines they collect." The crowd began to applaud, recognizing that they were witnessing something more significant than just the resolution of an unusual bet. They were seeing the restoration of respect for knowledge and expertise, the recognition that human skill and experience had value regardless of how they were packaged. Henry pocketed the Ferrari's keys and looked around at the faces surrounding him. 3 hours earlier, these same people had been prepared to mock him as a delusional homeless person. Now they were applauding his expertise and supporting his vision for preserving traditional mechanical knowledge. "There's one more thing," Henry said as the applause died down. "I'm not keeping the Ferrari." The statement surprised everyone, including Alexander. What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to sell it and use the money to fund the programs we just discussed. $48 million can provide scholarships for a lot of young mechanics and support services for a lot of homeless craftsmen. Alexander stared at Henry with obvious amazement. You're going to give away a $48 million Ferrari? I'm going to put it to use, Henry corrected. I've spent my entire career fixing things that were broken. Now, I want to fix the system that allows master craftsmen to end up homeless, while society throws away their knowledge and experience. Victoria Ashworth stepped forward. Henry, that's incredibly generous, but you shouldn't have to shoulder this burden alone. I'd like to contribute to your programs as well. Other guests began offering similar support, recognizing that Henry's vision represented an opportunity to address problems they hadn't even realized existed. Within minutes, pledges totaling several million additional dollars had been made. Alexander Sterling looked around at his guests, then back at Henry. The evening had started as a typical display of wealth and privilege, but it had evolved into something approaching a social movement. Henry, Alexander said, I think you've just revolutionized how we think about expertise, value, and social responsibility. This is going to change everything about how Sterling Motors operates. Over the following months, Henry Thompson's transformation from homeless man to automotive industry legend became national news. His story resonated with people across the country who recognized the broader implications of his experience, the waste of human potential that occurred when society valued credentials over capability and appearance over expertise. The media coverage began with local Los Angeles news stations picking up the story of the homeless man who had won a Ferrari by demonstrating forgotten mechanical knowledge. The narrative was irresistible, a real-life David versus Goliath story that challenged assumptions about worth, value, and social hierarchy. Within weeks, the story had spread to national news networks, automotive magazines, and social media platforms where it generated millions of views and sparked passionate discussions about expertise, homelessness, and social justice. Henry found himself overwhelmed by the attention. Reporters wanted to interview him about his background and his years of homelessness. Automotive enthusiasts sought him out to share their own stories about undervalued expertise and forgotten craftsmanship. Social justice advocates embraced his story as an example of how society failed to recognize and utilize human potential. Business leaders wanted to understand how they could better identify and develop overlooked talent within their own organizations. But Henry remained focused on the practical implications of his newfound platform. He understood that media attention was fleeting and that lasting change required systematic effort rather than momentary inspiration. The programs he had envisioned during his conversation with Alexander Sterling became his primary focus. The scholarship program Henry established grew beyond his original vision, attracting support from major automotive manufacturers who recognized the need to preserve traditional mechanical knowledge alongside modern technological innovations. Students learned to diagnose problems using both computer diagnostics and intuitive mechanical assessment. Young people from across the country applied to Henry's program, many sharing similar backgrounds of economic disadvantage and limited educational opportunities. The selection process prioritized demonstrated mechanical aptitude and passion for automotive technology over traditional academic credentials. The program for identifying and assisting homeless skilled tradespeople revealed the scope of knowledge that was being wasted on America's streets. Henry's team worked with social service agencies to identify individuals whose professional backgrounds included valuable skills that could be developed and utilized. Sterling Motors became a model for how luxury businesses could operate with social consciousness, attracting clients who valued the company's commitment to preserving traditional craftsmanship and supporting skilled artisans. Alexander Sterling discovered that his reputation was enhanced rather than damaged by his association with Henry Thompson's story. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people thought about expertise and respect. Henry's story reminded society that knowledge and skill could be found in unexpected places, and that assumptions based on appearance or circumstances were often completely wrong. Universities began incorporating Henry's story into their curriculum as a case study in innovation and problem-solving. Business schools used it to teach students about recognizing talent from diverse sources. The ripple effects extended beyond the automotive industry, with organizations examining how they could better utilize experienced practitioners and develop overlooked talent. A year after the night when Henry Thompson had silenced a room full of wealthy socialites by starting an impossible Ferrari, he stood in his new workshop at Sterling Motors, teaching a group of young apprentices how to diagnose engine problems by listening to subtle changes in mechanical rhythms. The students were a diverse group, representing exactly the kind of individuals that traditional automotive training programs often overlooked. They included teenagers from inner-city schools, veterans transitioning to civilian careers, and middle-aged workers whose previous industries had been eliminated by technological change. "The most important tool you have," Henry told his students, "isn't any piece of equipment or diagnostic computer. It's your ability to think logically about mechanical systems and your willingness to consider possibilities that other people might dismiss." One of his students, a 19-year-old named Marcus who had grown up in foster care, raised his hand. "Mr. Thompson, how do you know when you found the right solution to a problem?" Henry smiled, remembering a time when he had been young and eager to learn. "You know you found the right solution when the machine tells you so," Henry replied. "Cars don't lie, Marcus. If you understand what they're trying to tell you, they'll always guide you toward the correct answer." The success of Henry's students validated his conviction that talent and capability were widely distributed throughout society, but that opportunities to develop those abilities were not. The workshop had become a destination for automotive enthusiasts from around the world who wanted to learn from Henry and observe the unique educational environment he had created. As the afternoon workshop session ended and his students began putting away their tools, Henry walked over to the Ferrari that had changed his life. He ran his hand along its perfect curves, remembering the night when it had roared to life in front of an audience that had expected him to fail. The car started immediately when Henry turned the key, its V12 engine settling into the smooth idle that marked a perfectly tuned machine. But the real miracle wasn't mechanical. It was the recognition that human knowledge and skill had value regardless of how they were packaged. Standing in his workshop, surrounded by young people learning skills that would provide them with dignified careers, Henry Thompson understood that he had accomplished something more significant than repairing a broken car. He had helped repair a broken system that wasted human potential and ignored wisdom that came from experience. The Ferrari would be sold to fund Henry's programs, but its legacy would live on in every student who learned that expertise transcended appearance, every homeless craftsman who was given a second chance, and every person who discovered valuable solutions came from unexpected sources. As Henry locked up the workshop that evening, he smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new problems to solve, new students to teach, and new opportunities to demonstrate that knowledge and skill never lost their value, even when society temporarily forgot to recognize them.